So, first of all, I'd like to start with a little bit about you. Where did you grow up?
Primarily Chicago, but every year from the end of World War II, we also went to a small town in southwestern Lower Michigan for a little summer family compound. And in the winters, we would sometimes go down to Hollywood, Florida. My father won a house in a poker game. That was, I don't think it was much of a poker game because it was not much of a house. It was one of the 1920s things of heavy stucco and thick block. And we spent the worst of the winter down there and then went back to Chicago and then out to Michigan. So I was always arriving late for the school year, having to figure out how to fit in and so on. Yeah.
And who were the people in the home that you grew up in?
My father, my mother. We had someone, I don't remember very well, taking care of me. My mother was 37 when I was born, and I was her first child. So this helped her. I had a half-brother by my father's first marriage, but we were not raised together. He was raised with his mother, and I didn't know him all that well. There were people who came through. We had lots of relatives. Every weekend, the men would come for card games, and the women in another room, card games. And then they would all sit around the big dining room table having... They were wonderful. They were the generation that read a morning paper and an evening paper and maybe two morning papers and two evening papers, and then they argued and they knew what they were talking about, or they didn't, but they argued anyway. And I couldn't wait to grow up to be able to participate in that sort of thing. I didn't go where the women played the cards. I wanted to be where the interesting conversation was. That was regular. That was a large part of our house. And my father was the baby of 9 who survived of 13. So he had sisters and brothers, and we spent a lot of time with the relatives. But in our house exactly, mostly the 3 of us, yeah.
And what do you know about where your family came from on each side?
I know more about my father's side. They came from, according to a memoir written by one of his sisters, a shtetl called Enzelen, which was outside Riga. But how long they lived there or where they came from to be there, I don't know. One by one, they came to America when the first uncle who went sent back the passage money, and then everybody went. So that family was completely in America by the time of World War II.
Do you know what the maiden name was on that side?
Yes. The line was Grusin, Grusin, but my grandmother married someone Schwartz, and then my mother, so it was Schwartz growing up. And my grandmother's name was Zora Mariasha, so I became Sara Marcia Schwartz, which was unpronounceable in English. Very, very difficult. Very shishy sounding.
And then on your father's side, we're going to talk a lot about that.
It's my mother's, Max Milton is my mother's.
Oh, right, your mother's side.
But I just wanted to finish the little that I know about that. We don't know when they got there, who the parents were, and it's a tremendous family because there were so many. They kept a tree, they had reunions, they had a family newspaper, but nobody knows beyond the first grandmother, Dina Grusin, who came to America widowed with all those children, but one by one, what the family name was or anything more than that. Just no. On my mother's side, Max Milton, the grandfather, married to Mary Milton. He was supposed to have been born in Warsaw. On the census papers I've been able to get, of course, it's Russia, it's Poland, it's whatever, the borders are changing. The dates are different at different times. We don't know more than the family name. We don't know that he was born there. We don't know when the family had reason to be there, or if they were just passing through when he was born. He had an older brother. They were both writers. They both went to trade school and learned to be wood and stone and plaster carvers and traveled the world as master decorators of important buildings. The ceiling of the 42nd Street Library in New York, the Reading Room, the public buildings in Johannesburg and Cape Town, things in London, just wherever. They spoke multiple languages, Yiddish, Russian, French, English, and who knows what else. And they published in all those languages. So they were extraordinary, or maybe not. Maybe there was a population that advanced and widespread. But reading about it, for me, I thought, serious people, yes. And they wrote. His older brother, Udall, whose name in English became Julian, Milton, when together they changed their, I guess, pen names and then the family names to Milton, from Colton, Koltun or Col, or we're not sure. No documents that I've been able to find. Maybe I need somebody there to search. But from what I've been able to find online, there's nothing that tells me anything about them, except in the biographies that were written about my grandfather, because he's in the lexicon, and his brother. But my grandfather has a column and a half, and his older brother has 2 inches, maybe. Although, talking with the other David today, the things, I left some material with him, which I have here for you. The brothers were very active once they left Poland as Miltons and were in London in radical circles, socialist, Zionist circles. They both belonged to the Fabians with George Bernard Shaw and Sidney Webb, and he was friends with all the Herzl's secretary and various people. So they got around. Yeah. Max had 3 of the children. No, he came to New York, and his firstborn son was there. Then they went back to London. They were hopping around. It's extraordinary when you think. It's like the people today who private jet, but they did it by ship and train and God knows what else. So he had one son in New York, went back to London, and had the second son, Julian, who is Ana's father, my mother, Selena, and I think possibly the next daughter, Dora, but the documents don't align. Some of it says New York, some of it says London. And then there was the baby, Nat, born in New York. So they finally had 5 children.
Do you have a sense of what their life would have been like as young people, growing up in Warsaw?
To a degree, there's a line that says that Udall turned his back on the yeshiva education that he had had. I think somewhere else I picked up that the family were, as common at the time, very strongly religious. And it's possible that both boys repudiated that and moved away because my grandfather was spoken of as a free thinker, and with their associations and so on, I think that could make sense. Those were the days when the children were hit on the knuckles for not following orders in the cheder and so on. I don't know anything accurately, any detail, any writing. I'm hoping that some of the translations of his material will give more information of that sort. They went to the trade school. I don't know anything about the trade school. I don't know if it was tuition free, if it was a benefit to the community, or if it was something that required a tuition. I don't know how long it took, but whatever it was, they were competent when they left to earn their living, but they also wrote. And from the time that they were young, they wrote and accumulated languages and were published from the time that they were young. So they had a certain standing in the literary world, and some of the biographies talk about them in those terms, that someone important has passed. Yeah.
Now, do you know the story behind the name change from?
That the story, and I hope it's true, is that they admired the English poet John Milton, whom they read, I think, in translation, but who knows, they could have read it in the original for all. Because I've seen some things that Max wrote in English, and they're as exquisite as I'm told his Yiddish was.
So you've mentioned that they did this craft work. Have you seen examples of that?
Yes. I have not. Well, I've gotten online photographs of things. The Tivoli Theater in Cape Town, I think, has been destroyed. The public buildings in Johannesburg are hard to know which were under their hand. The library, I have a printout from the 42nd Street Library, but the contractors subcontracted, and they don't have a list of the artisans who worked on subcontract. So all we know is what was said. However, my mother's younger sister, the one who had no children, Dora, developed into an interesting and occasionally lunatic woman. After my father died and she lived with my mother, she tried to isolate my mother from the rest of the world. It's very dangerous. And when my mother had a stroke and I was required to do an inventory of the apartment because I was her guardian, there was a family album, the photographs that you have, that she didn't want to release to my attorney or to me. And we had a wild scene, which I don't think we have time to describe. But then I got them because my plan was to, when I found those, to have multiple copies made and give them to all the cousins so that everybody would have them. But she wanted just possession. Then she died, and I was able to, or I had to, document and inventory and dispose of her things because I was the relative. In a stock pot in the back of a kitchen cabinet, wrapped in towels, I found a carved oak dog, a beautiful, and carving oak with refinement and delicacy without armatures means things can fall apart because of the grain. Just the most exquisite, and I have a picture of it. Wonderful, wonderful thing that she hid away so that nobody could know, or she wouldn't share, she wouldn't let that. So yes, I have those things. And of course, there are the books, and there are there is the play, and we're looking for the missing other items that are indicated in the obituaries, but have not been found.
So, do you know anything about the relationship between the brothers, Yudel and
I think
Max?
it was admiring. The elder, Julian, or Yudel, died in 1917 or 18, but I don't know whether it was the Spanish flu or something else. I don't know where. I have a document from around 1940 or maybe circa, from Paris, signed by Max, notarized by the consul, right, to my mother, saying, I have a cemetery lot outside Chicago. I'm not going to use it. I don't know what he meant by that, but everybody would. But I want you to make it available to someone else of the Jewish faith who can use it because it's not my intention. So I don't know if he planned never to come back to America, which he did later, or whether he just didn't want to. I don't know if there was a cost involved in maintenance, whatever it was. He said, dispose of it. I came across that paper. I contacted the cemetery to see what the story was. A fellow there said, I can send you some pictures. He sent pictures of a fallen tree trunk monument, like bark and all that, with some garlands of like flat surface so that it could have topography. And Julian was listed as Julian Miltone. The date of death was something like that, and there were some things in Hebrew which were translated to me as felled in his youth. Well, he wasn't that young, or too early, fell too early. And I thought maybe Max had carved it, but the fact that it had fallen over worried me because there were 6 burial spaces in this, and Max had said that he had this one. So if he had that one, but the monument on it had fallen across any of the other, which didn't look like anybody was in them, just that one alone. But still, if it was somebody else's property, we shouldn't be impinging on it, and I wanted to know. So I contacted that same fellow, and he said, if you're ever around Chicago, come, we'll visit, we'll go see it, and maybe we can find out something. I did, he did. So we're standing in this 6-lot space, and around us are all kinds of other monuments. It was the Warsaw Cemetery section, benevolent, outside Chicago. And where I was standing, the ground was a little lower. So and he had gotten someone with a forklift to roll it because the writing was below, the way it had fallen. Yeah. So he said, this is not administered by my office. There's another one. Let's go there. They looked up and found a file card that gave no information about the Julian Milton burial. No idea who did it, no document, no death certificate. So the question in my mind was, if he died in America, what was he doing in America? If he died in Europe, how did his body get here? And so while those questions were going around, the person turned the card and said, oh, there's somebody else buried there. Max Milton. In the low space where I had been standing was my grandfather's grave. A real gooseflesh moment. It had sunk, whereas the other one was higher by, maybe a foot to a foot and a half. But this had sunk. Who buried him? When was that done? It was done by my mother. Why was there no marker on there? Had it been stolen? Because people used to go to get the precious metals, bronze or brass and copper. Remember that period of time when all those garden hose nozzles were being stolen because people wanted to get the metal? So I thought, well, this is her father. Why would she not have had some kind of a casket that would have survived longer rather than collapsing like that? And why was there no marker unless it was stolen? So that raised all sorts of questions about their relationship, which I could only wonder and never surmise. Yeah.
Did you ever hear about him from your mother?
Yes. In fact, from her and from the others, she spoke of him remotely, as a rather remote person, because he was a traveler. And then Mary was really raising the children. After Mary had a stroke, she was taken care of in New York City by Dora and her husband. And Max was in Chicago from the time that I was probably 5 or 6 years old, if not earlier. And I was born in 1937. So, as was Aina, a day apart. I don't know if she told you. And we want to check our dates of birth to see if they can give us the hour, and we can correct for the time zone and see if maybe it was even closer. The same day. The information was that he traveled. She took care of him. I mean, she was taken care of by my mother, and my father took care of Max. And one day my mother took me to see him. He was living, if you know the old Chicago districts, off Roosevelt Road, 12th Street, and so on. He wasn't there. I don't remember going there. I don't remember how we found out that he wasn't in his apartment. But we were on the sidewalk, and suddenly coming toward us was this man, bone-thin man in the kind of suit that kind of hangs, with a white cane, tapping along the street. He lived alone, but he could care for himself. I remember just being small and looking up and seeing him at a distance and then seeing him close. And I sort of remember going up this dark, steep staircase. I don't remember what was at the top. I don't remember how long we were there, anything that happened when we left. I never saw him after that. Where was I going with this? After that, he went to live in the Home for the Jewish Blind, which is in this book as the
publisher.
Publisher. Well, the reason for that was that my father paid for that to be published and sold for the benefit. And he gave, I guess, the copyright or whatever to them or to Max, which I didn't know until I saw this thing. And I was startled because I didn't know that my father had done that. Not that he wouldn't, but I had no idea that he had. But the Home for the Jewish Blind was his pet charity, and he maintained that for a very long time, helping to raise funds and doing various things. And all I knew was that Max was there. So I called those people to say what you have from the old days when you were on Douglas Boulevard or in the new place, and they had no records anymore. They just lost them in whatever time took from them. So what was the question? I'm going to wander.
The question was sort of story, what you had heard about your grandfather growing up, maybe from your mother or aunts and uncles.
So from her, she found it important enough to take me to see him or to go to see him and have to take me along. I don't know the details. I think if there was strong affection, it was for her mother much more. Mary had a stroke, as I say, and lived with Dora and Harry. And all I remember of her was that she was a woman in a chair who had been dressed, toileted, very long black hair without one gray hair, just long black hair that had been braided, which she couldn't do, so Dora must have done it, wound around her head, coronet fashion, and just sitting there. Some later pictures of her, when she, and we were all one time in Florida, and then later she died, and I can't find any real information. There are no documents. She's supposed to have been buried, according to Charles, in a family grave in Manhattan, but I can't find anything. Now, from Aina, did she tell you about the haircut story with her father
and how
that varied from my sense of it? Because in her story, her father had his mother, Mary, be the angry, outraged, difficult parent at the boy's haircut. And Max, the forgiving father, who was supposed to take him to the woodshed, and instead gave him a rare British coin. Well, that's interesting because the story later that I heard and that Charles told in his memoir was that Julian disappeared. Nobody heard from him again except one time when an unsigned letter came to the family with a coin, a rare coin inside. Now that's all. And who knows how accurate his recollection is. Yes, he was a scientist and scrupulous, but that was a childhood memory. That was a different thing. And many years had passed. So I don't know if Julian was trying to send something back or if the story about the haircut was one that was current and Charles somehow constructed and confabulated the thing. I just don't know. Yeah. Who else spoke about them? Dora had horror stories. First of all, my mother was the favored one. That was the family story, was that she was the favored one. She looked like, in her description, a Madonna. She had olive skin, an oval face, dark hair, and she was very lovely. You see the pictures. Dora, who was a few years younger, was a miskite, a poor homely child who just wasn't appreciated or was difficult. And we don't know what it was. But Max's treatment of her, as told, was that they lived in a tenement and he didn't want her in the house or to be fed. And he just pushed her out of the house and into the hall, and that my mother would put a dish of food in the hall, like feeding a pet. Now, I don't know how that would be possible to live like that. And it raises all kinds of questions about, well, what about him, what about him, what about? But that was the story in the family, that my mother took care of Dora. And that's why years later, when there was this opportunity for Dora to get hers back by dominating my mother, she did it. And that led to all kinds of distress later on. But in the meantime, Dora was taking care of her parents as my mother was taking care of Max. And I'd never heard anything from Nat, who was the baby, came to visit me in college, insisted that that I shouldn't let the strictures of the family govern my life. That's all that I can remember. But he was a wordsmith too. And that's the other thing. The whole family, verbose, wordsmiths, very careful handwriting. If there's a harder way to say something, by all means do that. If there's a flowery way to say something, make it beautiful. And everybody, and it wasn't until I met Aina and she described her father and how that training that must have come from Max or Mary, who knows, filtered down in these separated parts of the family with such symmetry. It was extraordinary. And that's what we keep finding, things that you were in California, I was in Chicago, and we had the same necessity to conform to a certain behavior, a certain standard, a certain image. Yeah, those were drivers in our family, yeah. And the thing about Mary that's possible, the story about her was that she was descended from 17 generations. Well, I heard 13 generations, but Charles had 17 in his memoir, including the Vilnagan. Now, everybody claimed that, and there was no way. But I got the Eliyahu's Branches book, and I tried to look up what did show up in a couple of documents as a maiden name for her. Did Aina tell you about Baron and Baron Vaux? Okay. Charles had said he thought that the maiden name was Baron, so I'm looking that up, and I don't find very many barons in that book, although there are barons all over the world. And I tried to contact a couple that might have had some relationship in Cincinnati area and so on. Nothing came of that. And then there was one document that had Baron-Vaux. That is French, and if anything doesn't fit, that doesn't fit. And we've never been able to document or get anywhere with that Baron Vaux thing. That's all we know about Mary, except that on the census, she goes between can write to can't write, and can read to can't read. And I think it's very interesting because she's been in America longer. Also, I remember one day holding a Bible in Hebrew with writing, like the Yiddish handwriting, that was supposed to have been hers. And of course I was young and had no consciousness of this is important and why do you have it and can I have it and don't lose it. I never knew what happened to it. And it would have been lovely if we had, because there might have been all kinds of births and deaths and family names and relationships, and who knows? We just don't.
So I want to ask a little bit about Max Milton's writing. Mm-hmm. Can you just introduce sort of what kinds of things he wrote?
Yes. Max started, and I have some of the biographies that quote some of the things, and more are being translated as we speak, but the translator's wife got ill, so I wasn't able to have them to bring, but later. He wrote from the time he was young. He was fascinated by poetry. He tried to perfect himself, worked hard, and he published some in Europe. And then so some of the biographies list all the publications, but getting the material. They may have published them once, but they don't necessarily have any copies today. So this is tough. And then he and his brother wrote as De Bruder Milton. They came to America. They published in the Forward and other press. And just as a sidebar, one of my projects is to try to find an example of what one of the biographies says, that his poems published in the Yiddish press were popular, and they were labor songs, revolutionary songs, radical songs of the time, protest songs. People would take one line and sing it to music of the time. Anonymously, maybe, with no attribution, because the other David tried to find it and everything and he couldn't. I would like to find, and I've been trying for, I would say, 15 years, to try to get just one small example of the words and the music. I joined the Jewish music list. I sent out a blanket request to everyone. Go to the Yiddish Book Center, read the poems for pleasure. And then, if you can recognize anything, let me know. I contacted Penn, Florida, Atlantic, the Library of Congress, so many archives and archivists to say, the Meloteks at the Folksman Theater, various theater people, just music people. The only response I got was from Frank London, who was wonderful. He couldn't be helpful, but he was wonderful. And he said, you ought to come up to Claes, Canada. But that's the side thing that is interesting to me, because it's called Lieder von Leben. And in one of the quotes earlier on in one of the biographies, there's a reference to one of my songs having been printed. Now, I don't know if that translation made the error of calling a poem a song, or if it really meant song, and that this is supposed to be songs from life. We don't know, and the word has both meanings. So I'm going with what I want to do, which is it's songs. And that means that if I can get that one piece, and if my translations can be connected through something, whether it's an emotion, a history, a place, a time, a style, something, and I have 10 or a dozen that could be a song cycle because they have a common arc, and then that one piece be the keystone for the composer to work around, I would have the selected poems read. I would scan them for their meter and their accent, so that would help a composer. The audio recording would help a composer to develop something, maybe using just that little piece as a motif, not copying the style, but something that, a little echo that would occur, but in whatever chosen mode. And then have it sung in the Yiddish with the program notes and translation in English. And Milken or one of those other archives might be interested in it. And to bring his voice back to the world. Because initially I didn't know what I had. I brought it here, and Catherine Madsen was wonderful. She gave me the biographies. She recognized his name so she could look it up. And you have so many priorities of important writers. He is not known except to some. So I couldn't tell if there was really quality that would be worth pursuing. So I met a wonderful cantor in Atlanta, Isaac Goodfriend, and his wife. We met, and it was, she and I, Betty, were like meeting a relative. She called me Sara. Nobody, since I was this big, called me Sara, and they were from Warsaw. They were survivors. They read the poems. They said they wanted to. They wept. They said, they are deep. They are very deep. And the Yiddish is exquisite. So I have been quoting them to other people with the invitation of, you can't, it's not a bad idea, just read them for pleasure, and then see if you can give some information back. I went out of town. I came back a week or 10 days later. She had died. Just like that. He didn't live long after that. So all that I got was the go-ahead from them. I said, should I do this? And they said, you must. And so that's how I know that there was reason to do this, that this is important. So I'm hoping that maybe in your cohort, somebody else will be inspired to weep the way they did and move this forward, so that the phrase that comes to my mind is giving voice, putting his voice back in the world, because this was touching to many, many people.
And what about for you when you read the translations?
It was fascinating. Is that your set of copies?
Yeah.
Did I show you the ones that I have?
Yeah, we have the translation in the other room.
Did you see the insert, the separate little poem? Okay. I didn't know what that was, but it was in the book in my mother's things when I had to clear out the apartment. I had been reading about the book center, about Aaron Lansky, and what do you call him?
Aaron.
Aaron, all right. Seems, in my generation, it's a little presumptuous, but all right. So I knew that you existed, and I wanted to be sure that this would be in gathering. But I couldn't mail it. That would be too cold. That was too remote. That was too unfeeling. I had to come with it and do it hand to hand. So I did, and I met Catherine, and things moved on from there. But there was the one, and I think you also had some courses to help people. And I have tried to learn Hebrew and Yiddish. There is something, they fall out of my head. I can remember all kinds of other things, but that I'm not good at language, except English, where we overdo it. But there was that thing, and I didn't know what it said. But it looked, from the little I knew, like a poem. It had a short line at the top, and then I knew that those were the final forms of the letters, so that they would have a rhyme. Henny Litwin, was that her name?
Lewin, yeah.
Lewin? Mm-hmm. All right, Henny Lewin read it for me. And she said, and I made a Xerox enlargement, so I had big channels between the lines. And then working with a Yiddish-English dictionary, I just went letter by letter by letter until I got a word. And then I looked up the word, and then I wrote in the word, but I was going right to left in Yiddish and left to right in English, so it was a little complicated to understand how to, but I got the gist of a lot of things that there were holes. There were things I couldn't find. And she said, of course you couldn't find them. They're not Yiddish. They're direct Hebrew quotations. So the title was Let There Be Light, several things along the way, and she explained what the poem was. And I knew he wrote it at that moment because it was an angry statement to God, whom he was not supposed to have believed in, because he was supposed to be a free thinker. You made all this beauty in the world, and then you made me blind, and now I cannot see you. Yes, yes. There was the religious thing, but the other part of it was just the amount of time that I had to spend looking at some of the letters to decode them, because his writing was quick, idiosyncratic in some cases, as if he dashed off the lines, but then as if at certain moments he put the pen into the paper a little harder, with a little thought, with a little hesitation, maybe a little emphasis. And the ink went into the paper more, so that those were thicker lines. The pressure or the absorption was different. And it was suddenly like looking over his shoulder in the time that he was writing it, the quick, like a dance step, quick, slow, quick, slow. It was absolutely fascinating, and I felt as if I were with him in the act of creation. It was an extraordinary moment, and I felt more of a bond to him than ever from holding that scrap of paper that I could tell then was his. Whereas the printed ones, I couldn't decode at all, or hadn't, and this one was so real. And it was maybe the last thing he wrote. Quite possibly, because the book was published earlier, and this scrap isn't in there.
We've looked at a few photos together, but can you describe what he looks like? Or I don't know if you have a memory from that day.
Well, yeah. As I say, he was thin, bony, wiry. I didn't know his height, and from those pictures, he looks fairly tall. But of course, Mary is very, very short. Aina said that her father spoke of having a watch, a pocket watch, that had belonged to an uncle in London who was 6 feet tall, or over 6 feet tall. And that is possible. If that was Udall, then he was that tall and Max was smaller. But we're not sure of who in those pictures, if they're of Udall or if they're of another relative or if they're of a friend. They're not necessarily marked with accuracy. Sometimes those things are in there and they're wild guesses, and those wild guesses get passed along to the next generation. And I don't know in some cases.
Any features that have trickled down the family? Prominent features?
Yes. If you notice the hair patterns that grow, they had those haircuts in those days that allowed deep trench curls and waves and so on. They had that. Let's see. Both women had straight hair. Charles, I think, did too. Nat, the baby, had more of a resemblance through the hair and the hairline. Pretty good honker noses, not necessarily curved as much as broad and strong. Kind of crinkly skin, a tendency, although there were some beards. Some of the pictures show Max writing. He looked like a person of reasonably good posture. One of the pictures has him looking so well dressed, like a dandy almost. I don't know if you have that picture.
Yeah, you
where
showed
he
me
has
that,
the watch chain and the hat and the whole business and the pointed polished shoes. I don't understand. I think he was better paid than maybe they let the children know, or Mary would be without funds for a long time, and they did have to scrape through, and then Max would come back with a payment for a job, and then things were better, and he'd get himself a suit. I don't know. They lived in London, in Walthamstow, in a line of houses that I found on Warner Road, and the history of those was that they were built around the late decade, I think, of the 1800s for immigrant families who were coming in. But they were not the poorest of the poor, because these were very nice new places at the time. The standard English narrow thing with a door here and a door there and a staircase and whatever. But I was able to go around and get Google pictures, because they're still standing, of the back of the house and have a sense of, unless there's been remodeling, but it looked pretty much the same. And there were architectural details. It was not just thrown up shelter. These were decent looking, either upper lower class or lower middle class, not middle class, but lower, still quite acceptable, quite decent. Yeah.
And what is your sense of this sort of traveling around the world that they did?
That has emerged as I've gotten little clues and things here. I think, and this, I don't have, first of all, I don't have a timeline. I've been trying to make a timeline for 25 years. It's been very hard to get translations. The first person I had was a man in Raleigh who apologized because he couldn't do better. But I didn't want to, oh no, that's not true. I was looking for, if it came to the poems, someone from the same area of the time who would understand the dialect or the nuances of Warsaw. Because sometimes, well, poetry is sometimes so opaque and hard to discern, but especially if you've got a language change, and I had to find somebody who would be sensitive to that and who wouldn't just be a translator for pay. I'm happy to pay, but I want a sensibility and I want a sense of heart. And there was a woman in Durham who was highly regarded, let's say. I don't want to give too many clues. And the first thing she said to me was what her charge was. And I thought I could go to a lawyer for something. And the lawyer I don't want is the one who tells me how much per hour. I want somebody to listen to my case and then tell me how much per hour. But she didn't even want to look at the poems. She just wanted to tell me right away what. So that was not going to work. It took a while. And eventually I found this man in Atlanta who's from Warsaw, has a theater background, he and his wife were able to get away and get to Italy, and then they came here, and he wanted to do the translations. What he did for 7 or 8 poems is impossible in most translation. He not only did the meaning, but he did the meter and the rhyme from Yiddish to English, and he did it with heart. They're just wonderful, wonderful things. Take me back to the question again. I don't want to wander.
That's fine.
You were asking me what?
We were talking about his writing and then his traveling around the world.
His traveling around the world, not having a timeline. So I've been trying to get this timeline, and it became more critical knowing that we were coming here, and as more material was available, I needed to know where to put it in terms of his life. So, and that would answer your question about what he did in different places. Yes, he was carving, but in some of those little pieces of information, I picked up the idea that in London he was printing and then returning to Russia or Poland or wherever he could, and bringing illegal, the things that were revolutionary materials from these presses that couldn't be in the countries themselves, but could be smuggled in. And that maybe he was doing that kind of thing. But again, until I get the timeline and the place and try to, it's going to take a little work. But that's my sense of what he was doing while he was carving and while he was meeting all the people and going to the First Zionist Congress and going to the Fabians and all the things that they were doing and getting a play. Do you know that David's grandfather and my grandfather were antagonists over their plays in London at the same time? This is the most remarkable. Does this fit?
Yeah, tell me, please.
Okay. The play, Chaos, was listed in the biography, but I couldn't find it. You didn't have it. I contacted Paul Glaser. Hesh, you know him? Where is he now? I can't find it. Well, anyway. And he said he couldn't find anything, but it was interesting, and if I were in New York, please come by. I did. And he went through their holdings and said, no, we don't have any Max Milton. Here's something, M. Milton. It's a play, Chaos. It was on the shelf in New York all this time, but it was in that delicate condition, just so flaky. So I got the copies, and I came home with it, and I was subscribing for years to the forward because there was so much information and contacts and names of people, and I would just keep a file on those and try to see, does anybody know anything? I read about Ellen Perrichman and this New Worlds Theater Project. So I sent her a copy of the manuscript that I had made from the one copy that I got from Hesh. 6 months later, she sent a letter and said, I apologize for the delay, but I have read the play and I love it. I want to translate it and I want to produce it. She did the translation. They workshopped it here. She hired a director. He didn't like it. And they canceled the production. And then she eventually closed the theater. I don't know if you know. The story, how did I get that story? In one of the biographies of Udall, that he knew Sholem Asch. He had done some negative reporting on God of Revenge.
Vengeance.
Yes, God of Vengeance. And obviously burned Sholem Asch significantly. Because when this was published and in London in 1909 and about to be produced, he came back with highly critical comments about this and kept it from being published. So twice this poor schlemiel of a play has not been produced, and then it was lost, and now it's turned up in many more places. But who knows if anyone ever will either use Ellen's translation or attempt another, because there may be elements that were hers, or she felt that there were long polemical sections in there that were just boring, and how to excise that and still keep the dramatic structure was the hard part. So she thought that she got that, but a second run through might be, but she might not be interested anymore. Yeah.
Wow.
So here I meet David, and it turns out that I'm bringing information while seeking information, and it's our grandfather's.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to just, if we could sort of piece together what you do know about the timeline in terms of he was born in Warsaw and then comes to London. And I know there's sort of back and forth in the U.S.
Tremendous amount of it. That is the thing that is so puzzling, that they traveled to do their work. That in itself, when you consider going back over the ocean, coming this way, I think in 1 year, as I got so far as to say that in a period of a certain number of months, he was in London, he was in Paris, he was in Moscow, he was in Poland, he was in New York, just everywhere. It was like that old, he's everywhere character. He was everywhere. And that was Max. Now, Julian was with Max and off on his own, but by 18 or 19, his life was over. And what happened after that is kind of unknown between let's say, well, that's not completely true. I came across a note that the Workmen's Circle, the Arbiter Ring, had sent him to Memphis in 1919, roughly, and he produced something. It was a book or a report or something titled When Blood Screams. So I contacted Workmen's Circle. What do you have? Nothing. They don't have a record of anything. The title suggests maybe race riots or lynchings or things that would have been going on in the South that would have interested a social justice organization to send someone, but I never thought of Max as a reporter, and yet he was sent to do something, and he produced something. We don't know what. A woman named Jocelyn Wurzburg came to the Atlanta Jewish Film Book Festival and in the write-up it said that she was from Memphis. It was her memoir, so I went to see her and talk to her. I told her about Max Milton and the book, and that I'd been searching. I had contacted history people in Memphis. I had contacted bookstores and temples, and nobody knew anything. No copies of anything anywhere. And she said, well, she'll put something out in her circle. And one of those who responded, and many did, was Josh Parshall, who's in Jackson, Mississippi, who did his doctorate on the Workmen's Circle, the Arbiter Ring, in the South, at UNC Chapel Hill, 9 miles from where I lived in Durham all this time, but of course I didn't know him as a graduate student. And he was fascinated with this whole story, and he's searching now to see if he can find what it was. If somebody has a copy of it somewhere, and that would be wonderful to know what it was and why it was. The closest we've come is a town in Arkansas called Elaine that had race riots around 1918, 1919. And they were, the reference to that comes up with several people's suggestions. Well, we don't know, but maybe it had something to do with what happened in Elaine. And it was about 100 miles or so from Memphis, so it's not impossible that he could have traveled by a train to Memphis and then gotten a ride somehow to Elaine and written about it. But we don't have any evidence yet. Yet is the important word, not yet. And I'm hoping that we will, because he would have been writing in Yiddish, but he also would have been describing the population and the circumstances, possibly with some English, which would have been useful to know his command in that. Yeah.
Well, I want to get a little bit more about you, and then we'll come back to this connection to your grandfather, if that's okay.
Do we have 3 days?
I just want to know sort of what was the atmosphere that you grew up in culturally? Was there religious observance? Sort of?
Yeah. It depended which of the brothers or sisters house when visited. Certain of the sisters kept Sabbath, and they had the Friday night dinners for the family, and the children were bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, well, mostly at that time bar mitzvah. Not in my house. My mother was a-religious and spoke of her father as a free thinker, and she spoke Yiddish. She spoke beautiful Yiddish. In fact, when my father brought her to the family to introduce her as his future wife, the sisters were outraged because, as I say, she looked like an Italian Madonna with this face. And the sisters, very rudely, were sitting and chatting in Yiddish to give him hell for having brought this woman who would break mother's heart. And my mother just sat there and very quietly didn't acknowledge anything until the whole dinner was over. And the story is that at the very end of it, in her father's exquisite and flowery Yiddish, she thanked the mother for having been so generous in welcoming her into her home, and that she hoped that she would make the son a proper and loving wife. And of course, all the jaws dropped because she had a great sense of timing. My father was not just a-religious, he was extremely skeptical of Bible stories. And he loved to say, here's a story that's superstitious or miraculous, and here's a logical explanation that could have been changed over time. For example, I remember when he said, and I was a child, and he would get me in these conversations that were impossible for me to participate in or understand. And one of them was that there was a quotation that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Suggesting what? Well, his explanation was that the rich man must have been corrupt, because otherwise he couldn't be a rich man. And he certainly couldn't get into heaven because he was contaminated in some way. But the camel passing through the eye of the needle was what got his attention. And he said, there is a passage in some famous rocks, get very narrow, and it's called the eye of the needle. And so here you have a meaning that is not metaphorical. It's just, you can't get through there with a camel. But it became a matter of high morality when it was used over time and then developed over generations. So that was the kind of thing he would do. Or he would ask me, he had the sayings of the fathers and the various books, and I think he read them. I think he thought about them, but I think he also doubted them so seriously. I went to Sunday school once, and I got a stomach ache. And the family conference afterwards suggested that it was Sunday school that gave me the stomach ache, and I never had to go again. So I didn't have any Jewish upbringing per se. I just had lots of relatives who were sitting around and speaking Yiddish and carrying on in their way, which was characteristic and wonderful. But I wasn't brought up to be observant. When I married my husband, he was from an observant family. It was like a mixed marriage. I went to holiday services for one of the first times that I'd ever, because we just didn't belong to a temple. We didn't do any of that. Not just secular, but indifferent to that degree.
If you can think back to when you were a kid, what do you think you thought about Yiddish? What would be your association with Yiddish?
Oh, the classic thing about the joke about the couple, that the little boy and the little girl, you know that story?
Not sure.
And we're going to play house, and I'll be the mama and you be the papa, and we'll do all these things, and then we'll put the children to bed, and what do we do now? And now we speak Yiddish.
So did you learn any words or phrases?
Yes. In common parlance, sure. Yeah, I could understand a lot. I couldn't construct a sentence, and I couldn't really tell you exactly or translate with any authority, but I knew the way a child learns a language. Yeah.
Did you ever go to the Yiddish theater or films in Yiddish?
Interesting question. I don't think so. I recently got a copy of, what is the title of it? It's the silent film about the rabbi's son, Alta something, who wants to go off and be an actor. And we used to hear these stories about, like, Jolson and the others, that sort of thing. Not Yiddish theater per se, but my father had a saying, and he would drop it at different moments when it didn't make any sense at all, which was part of his sense of humor. And he would get into a posture and a presentation mode, and he'd say, never a greater man lived than he. And then 2, 3, 4, Boris Tomaszewski. It took me years to find out who that was. I didn't ask him at the time because he was my father doing something strange and I wasn't going to ask. But Boris Tomaszewski was, and then when I found out later that Michael Tilson Thomas was his grandson, I could put it all together, yeah. So my father knew that. The other thing was that my grandmother was quoted by her daughters as saying, which implied that they went to the theater, and we can't be sure that that was true, buy the best ticket you can afford and do not go on an empty stomach. And later, when I was a teenager and going to the theater, I was told, your grandmother used to say, da-da-da. So maybe they had a life with more opportunity to do those things than we know. In fact, reading today with some of your exhibits about the theater opportunities, I didn't realize that there were so many, because from the stories and the information that I had, it would have been so difficult, like that film, for someone to break away, to become part of a theater world, a secular world, as opposed to the village life or the Orthodox life.
So how did you end up starting to research your family history?
Found that and wanted to bring it here, brought it here, and was given the yeast. Mm-hmm. And what has been your experience here at the Yiddish Book Center during your visits? Outstanding. We were talking going into lunch because for Aina, I don't know if she expressed this, but she had a little time between finishing with you to percolate, and she said, I feel like they gave me my history today, and this is beyond what I was able to do just by being and sharing family pictures and the stories and so on, telling them that they were from a Jewish background, which they didn't know, and so on and so on. But what you gave them today was an embrace of so much more of the culture. What I could do was particular, but your is global.
Would you mind just telling the story of how you two met?
Yeah. I had been going to Ancestry.com for a very long time, but not subscribing, because I really wasn't getting very far, and I didn't see much more coming. But every so often they would have the 2-week free trial, and I would do it again. So on the second round, I had, when I started, I had gone to a Mormon facility in North Carolina, and I got a little bit, but not much of anything. Not that much was online at the time. It just didn't connect. So then I had gotten a little bit online and gone out of the system and come back later, got up a little more information, and something led to a page where a message came up and said, seeking information about Max and Mary Milton. well, I'm seeking information about Max and Mary Milton, but who else? Not my cousin Dan. His younger brother died. They have some children. He has some children. But the timing and the interest really wasn't there. And Charles, the firstborn, Dan's father, didn't even want to talk about his father. He would just shut down when I would ask him anything at all. His relationship with Max must have been so terrible that he just wouldn't communicate anything. So couldn't be their kids. I contacted the person, and it turned out that she was a family friend who was adept at computer stuff. So for the family, she put in a message and was taking any responses. They had been doing it for 2 years with no response, and they were about to take it down. The timing was just such that they hadn't taken it down, and I was cheap enough only to be there at that time. We made the connection. She gave what I told her to the family, and then they got in touch, and Ana and I spent hours on the telephone talking. Then I spoke with her younger brother. She may have mentioned Douglas, who subsequently has kind of gone around a mental corner. But the firstborn, Angus, had died years ago, so there was no knowing him. But I spoke to his widow, and I spoke with Douglas, and we have a family that we didn't know, and they have a family that they didn't know. And I sent them, photocopied everything I could, sent it to her. But the interesting thing was that here they were, a Catholic family with a father who was apparent Scotsman, and Max and Mary Milton were Jews, and I didn't know quite how to tell them. They needed to know, but I wasn't sure what their reaction might be. And they were not surprised. They said, we were not that surprised. Why? Why were you not so surprised? Well, things our father said, occasional word. He was taciturn and very protective. He didn't tell us if he had brothers or sisters. He denied his past, and he just wouldn't talk. But he would drop a word that was inappropriate given his background. If he hadn't come from the Lower East Side of New York, why would he know this and why would he know that? But they were not going to question it the way children generally don't pursue a question. And so when I came in with their information, they were not that surprised. Then I had one more conversation with Douglas. It was very sensitive because he was saying he was not that surprised. Well, I didn't know if Max and Mary did or would have circumcised their sons, but if they did, then Ana's father would have been circumcised. And then the question is, would he have circumcised his sons? And I didn't know quite how to get into that with Douglas, and very gently I did. I said, was there ever a time when maybe you saw your father naked, maybe coming out of the shower, and you saw something different in your genitals that was... And he said, I think that's it. And he went back to a memory of being young and noticing just something distinctive, but not having a context. And according to Ana, her father covered this by saying it had been some kind of a war injury or occurrence that required some snipping here and there. And that was his explanation. So Douglas was more open to the conversation. And indeed, he had not been circumcised and his father had been. So, and again, I don't know if that answered your question because
yeah, it did.
I'm really free associating
No,
here.
you're doing great. You're doing great. I'm curious sort of personally what is important in terms of your Jewish identity at this point in your life.
It's so strong. Yeah. But as I say, I've tried to learn the language and I am just inept. It's hopeless. It's that I cannot sing. I think it's, I had endoscopy because I even couldn't talk sometimes. I would just get hoarse. And when I try to carry a tune or phonate for any length of time, it would all crackle around. I was afraid it was throat cancer. I went to a vocal studio medical. They took pictures and said, no, it's not that. You don't have cancer. You have asymmetrical cords. They're just badly formed, and they cannot work the way cords should form or should work. I think my brain is the same way when it comes to uncharacteristic alphabets. I just cannot remember. I've tried to learn the Cyrillic alphabet. I've tried to learn various other alphabets. I'm trying to learn kanji. I just don't do it. It doesn't stick. So that's out of the question. However, words and quotations, phrases. She'll drop a phrase like, we were having lunch, and we went to the Veracruzana, and it was lovely. And she said something about miles to go before I sleep, but she didn't quite have the quote. I had the whole poem, and I can do some things that I can't do others. So I've done design work. For example, I redesigned the Torah Ark when we lived in Michigan. I did a lot of work for Sisterhood and design. I have sent my children to Sunday school. I didn't have my daughter, Bas Mitzvah, but my son was Bar Mitzvah in Honolulu, which was lovely because they had 2 services at the same temple, with the Orthodox on Saturday morning and the Friday night service for the general membership. And so all the older people came out for that, and they did something I had never seen. As my son walked with the Torah, they threw the candy in the air. And I got goosebumps from that because I knew it was something authentic, but I'd never seen it. And it just made that moment more wonderful for me because it linked generations in a way that I couldn't have done. Yeah.
And what has it meant for you personally to have these writers in the family, these Yiddish writers in the family?
Oh, that's interesting. What has it meant? Purpose to do this. I told the other David, I must have lived this long for something because I'm not done. This is a job and I'm not done with it. It's a lot to do. But I would hope that I could help, not delegate exactly, but share some of the ongoing investigation with some of the people from your cohort who might be interested in working, making Max Milton a personal project, who might get inspired and want to do that. Oh, to go back one layer, I cooked. My mother-in-law was a great cook, and my mother was a good cook too, but not so much Jewish food. My aunts were wonderful, and they were all seamstresses. So I learned to sew from them. I learned to cook from them. I made challah, I made chopped liver. I did all the holiday kinds of foods, and I did during the week things. And we did the Friday night candles so that the children had a sense that there was, again, continuity and meaningfulness, that they were not just somebody somewhere, that they were of a tradition. Language, food, decoration, this. Giving voice is very important. When somebody has spent a life, it's like lace. I collected needle lace that was made by the women who had very few options in life, and it was in a time when that exquisite, delicate work could only be done by hand, but people lost their eyesight doing it. But the women didn't have, if they didn't marry, or they weren't in the church, or they weren't this or prostitute or whatever, they made lace, and they lost their eyesight doing it. And protecting it and passing it along was honoring it in later years. I wanted to honor this in later years. This was a man's life, just as that was those women's lives. He had something to say, and it's your mission, and it became part of mine, to bring it so that people could hear what he had to say and the way he said it. Because if what was described as remarkable about his use of the language, then that should be known to more people so that their use of the language could be enhanced, and with a beautiful example. And so that's what it means to me.
Great.
Oh, and I should say one more thing.
Please.
My son is not so involved. Mother's busy, it's a good thing. But to my daughter, this means a great deal. When she moved to Charleston, I got her Eli Evans' book on the provincials so that she would understand the community, and she just fit right in, and she's been active with the youth group at KK Elohim and so on. And she's been along with me on this ride in a sense, that encouraging, following, telling people, and so on. And she loves that her grandfather was somebody whose thoughts and words are being preserved to last into later time. That means something very important to her too. Yeah.
That's great. Well, I do have a couple more questions we always like to ask, but are there any other stories or reflections that we didn't get to?
Did I write anything in the intake papers? Because between now and then I may have forgotten.
Yes, that's probably a good idea. Let me just take a look.
It's a shame, but that's what happens.
There's an autobiography that hasn't been found.
Yes, and I remember holding a typescript. I must have been about 9 or 10 years old. So I was born in 1937. He died in 1946. That's about right. Why it was in English, I don't know, because I could read it. And it was called The Four Freedoms. There's also something called the 11th Commandment that is out there somewhere, or so it says. Again, who knows? So I would love to find those things, and I'm hoping that if he can be lifted out of the present obscurity to some level where more people will know that something they have, oh, that's what that is. Let's send it to Amherst. That would be wonderful, because then we can get those pieces back. And I'd love to have the autobiography, because that would be, granted that there's a lot of individual fudging that goes on in autobiographies, but to have his story, as he would tell it, would be a lot of information. And it might even be family history beyond him, which is what we can't access. I'd have to get somebody to go through repositories in Poland, and I don't even know if it's Warsaw. And when I looked it up online, there are these Jewish Gen and the other things. They're according to this gubernia and the other gubernias and so on. And if you look in the wrong one, it isn't possible to find. And I don't know what name to use. I don't know if Colton was the name, or if that was a change. Because these people were given to changing names all the time. My grandfather changed his name. Her father changed his name. It's a lunatic family. They made up their own rules and they lived by them. And I don't know what to do to get into their history. It just, maybe eventually those things will become accessible more than they are, and I hope I live long enough to do that, or I hope somebody else will pick it up and continue.
Yeah. Well, I think we did cover everything that you wrote in here. I want to ask, sort of from your perspective, what is the place of Yiddish nowadays?
That interesting question. What is the place of Yiddish? I think you'd have to ask a more specific question, because there are places like yours and theater companies where it's active. And I remember years ago, even after the demise of the Second Avenue Theater, that there were companies producing in Yiddish, and non-Yiddish speakers attended and somehow got it. I don't know if that's still going on. I don't think there's a lot of use of it in music in a popular sense, but I have friends who are tango musicians from Uruguay. Oh, that would be somebody for you to interview. Polly Furman, F-E-R-M-A-N. You should look her up. It's Glamour, G-L-A-M-O-U-R, tango. She's from Montevideo and travels the world. She just moved to Valencia in Spain. But her family's from Ukraine. And we thought that maybe we were related because Frooman, who knows? I went through YouTube and found all sorts of Yiddish tango from the earlier century being performed now by troops in Europe and in Israel. And she was going to go to Israel, so trying to get her some material together to have a list of people to meet and where to go and all that. And the director of the Atlanta Opera, with whom she was working on Maria de Buenos Aires, is Tomer Zvulun from Israel. So he would help her to make connections there. But I told her about you and that she might have a story to tell if that can be coordinated and if there's mutual interest, which one never knows. So there's that. And in my understanding is that the Forward still publishes a Yiddish edition as well as a Russian and English, that there's some small amount of publication in Yiddish now, but beyond that, not too much. But the young group you have who are so interested, and it was fascinating too, in the intake overview orientation, the statistics that Aaron gave about the number of courses and the number of universities and the number of participants. It was wonderful to read that there was that much. So present, I think it's solid and developing, and the future, I think, could be anything. The other thing I wanted to know was where in the mountain are the digital masters stored? Because I wanted to be able to show Aina if we
I'll show you when we go out. Yeah.
Stood and looked. Because I love that idea of preserving the language against almost anything. That's so exciting and wonderful and heartening to know that there is a protection for something so fragile. I had no idea that there were that many books. I don't know if anybody knows how many at all. And that most of them, or the large part, were published in the United States. What an active press that must have been. And what an active distribution network it must have been. And it explains something that I don't know how accurate it was, but in the film Yentl, the carts full of books being taken from city to city or shtetl to shtetl, I thought, I've never forgotten that image, that the book carriers, not the Packenträger per se, but just the businessmen carrying books around were so much a feature of life. I love that. Just knowing that there were people they could know would be at the end of the day's trip, who would buy their wares, who would want what they had to bring, who were ready to read it. That's wonderful. Yeah. So I don't know, in this time of iPads and smartphones, how that translates to millennials and younger who don't hold books who don't hold books for pleasure. They hold them as needed, as required, but I don't know if they are readers per se. I don't know. I can't answer that because I don't know. But it's an interesting thought, and I'm sure if anyone can help it move forward, it's your organization. There's none like it.
Well, we always like to close by asking whether, sort of looking back on this rich life, which you didn't talk too much about, but
I've had a lot of decades and something different every decade.
Do you have any advice for younger people, those people younger than millennials, sort of future generations?
Advice. I don't like to give advice. Advice. Read history. Read lots of history and read different opinions. It isn't just that the victors write the stories. It's that the stories people have to tell come from different points of view. And it's important to understand that everything can be turned and looked at a different way. And there's so much history, and it's so, it must be known. To grow up without a sense of it, as I did. I do remember going to events that were raising money to do things in Israel, the trees or the Israel bonds or things like that. But I didn't have a context for that. And I remember the little jar, the blue and white pushki. But as a child, it just wasn't that much. And I got into it. I hope they will too. But it really helps to be encouraged. Yeah.
Great. Well,
there's one more thing. I would say, if your parents want to send you to a Jewish school, go. Really and truly, because I just think they're better schools. Schools are so crummy today. Don't depend on public education. Don't depend on... My kids go to a private academy in Atlanta, and they're being raised to be citizens of the world, which is a Zionist, Marxist, socialist view, not to be Americans who have a global interest, to be strong Americans. That is secondary. It's be a citizen of the world. And I don't want them to be citizens of the world. I want them to think of themselves as Americans, as Jews, and be competent in the world. They're missing something if that's the only thing they get, disconnected from their roots. And if I would give advice, I would say, don't go to that school and don't go. It's like eat this, not that. Attend here, not there. Go to a Jewish academy, and you're going to get some history and a point of view and good thinking. And I would say, if your parents want to do it, go do it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming and bringing all of these amazing materials. We'll take a minute to look at them. There we go.
This is a play, Chaos, by Max Milton with Udall Milton, his elder brother, published in London, 1909, by the Hebrew Publication Society, dealing with... Did I tell you the story about the heroine in this? The suicide? Oh, this is very interesting. The character in here, the heroine, is a young woman her friends, the people she knows, are radicals, firebrands, and one in particular who opposes marriage, but does not oppose getting her pregnant, will not marry her, and she's a suicide. Karl Marx had a daughter with the same story. I have that paper in that pile. Was that art imitating life? Life imitating art? Drama imitating both? Where did Max and Udall get the story? Was it because they were in those circles? Did he dramatize something that he knew that closely? Or was it in the headlines? Or did he make it up and there was just some kind of eerie coincidence, given their philosophies, that became a possibility, an unanswered question? But this is the play script. Mm-hmm. The prologue, or the preface, is written by, and this was very interesting to the other David, the question of modernism, which they call decadent writing at the time, was very important in literary circles. And apparently there were things in this play that some of those long, boring speeches were about. So he was going to look into that because for his purposes, they could be very interesting. Also, there are a couple of poems in here that are not in the other volumes, and I have translations of those. So,
just wanted to thank you.
Oh, thank you, Christa. After all these years, it is so lovely to meet you and to know that you've done so much and you're continuing to do it.